All right. Good morning, Mount Olive. We want to give you the next devotion on the prodigal son, and we are in Luke in chapter 15, and we are excited to go over what we have today for our devotion. We know that Jody did a great job with the selfishness, right? That's what he talked about when he said, "Give me," and he talked about being selfish. And selfishness took him out of the Father's love, right? And took him on his own way. So that's where we're going to pick up today. All right. So here is the prodigal. And what we're talking about tonight, of course, or today, is sin and suffering. Sin and suffering. Question for you. People are going to ask you, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? If God is such a good God, if he's such a good God, then why is there suffering in the world? That's the question. Why does he allow suffering? Where is the origin of suffering and evil? Those are the things we're actually going to pick out today out of this prodigal son's parable. It's really interesting. We all struggle with the meaning and the purpose and the origin of suffering. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Remember the motivation, as Jody did a great job reviewing that. Jesus is standing and he is being criticized by the political elite and the religious elite. A lot of people I've heard lately talk about Christianity, and they say that, Christianity is a religion of elitism. But that's not true. Christianity, even from the time of Jesus, has always been for the oppressed or for those who are the underdog, so to speak. Jesus did more than any other leader, right, for social injustice and for those who are oppressed. And so it's in this tension that they are blaming Jesus of being some religious leader that also accepts sinners. He's a sinner acceptor. And they're criticizing him, and they're stirring up public animosity towards him, saying, these rumors and these gossip that Jesus is a sinner acceptor, and he's like those sinners. At one point they say, you are who you hang out with, right? So to answer that, Jesus gives these series of parables that all points to a different part of salvation. And the motivation in each of those, they end with a party. Every parable, these three parables, ends with a party, and a party in heaven, to show that the ultimate joy of heaven is that the Son of Man came to this earth to seek and to save that which is lost. The salvation of the lost. And that is the great joy of heaven. And that should be the great joy of Mount Olive. And that should be the great joy of my ministry. That should be our aim, our goal, our motivation. So he is giving them the reason why he's allowing these sinners to come and listen to him, because his motivation should be their motivation. But we know that we find that in this, that they are actually the elder son in this. And we are to ask ourselves, which one are we? And so today, again, we're going to look at this point here that is showing that sin and suffering, verses 13 through 16, right? Sin and suffering right here, verses 13 through 16. All right, so in verse 13, let's look at that real quickly. And not many days hence, after the younger son gathered all together, and we know that up to this point, the younger son, he went and said, "Oh, daddy," or went to his dad and said, "Daddy-o, give me all of my inheritance." And you usually don't get your inheritance until the father is dead. So in effect, he's saying, "Daddy-o, you're dead to me. I don't want your rules and regulations. I'm walking out of here, and I want what's coming to me. I want your hard-earned money that's coming to me when you die." And so he took that, right? And he took his journey. And I've highlighted he took his journey. That's when the sin happened. It wasn't a far country. The far country was the atmosphere and the path of sin. The sin happened when the young son decided to go his way in an opposite direction of the Father's way, the Father's will, the Father's plan. And that's what we do, even as Christians sometimes. When we decide to live our life in our way and justify and reason it out and go in our direction, and we ignore God's way and God's direction, that's where sin is conceived. And so he sinned, right? And he went into a far country and there wasted. And that's the definition of prodigal. Jody kind of brought that out. He wasted, he ruined it, his substance with riotous living. And now we get to our points for the day. Verse 14, it says this, and when he had spent all, there it is. I should have highlighted that. When he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. He spent all. There was nothing left. He was now without necessity. Point number one. When we sin, the result of sin, suffering is not something that is created. Suffering is the effect or conclusion of a condition or an action. It's the consequence of a decision. And so suffering comes from sin, where he took his journey. When we go our way and not God's way, that's sin. And so the effect of that is not nothing that's been created. It's just the atmosphere and the consequence of going that way. The consequence of sin is suffering on this world. When Adam and Eve decided to go their own way and ignore God's way, right? The result of that was universal suffering overall. Sin entered into this creation. It ruined God's perfection of creation. It brought in suffering into this world. And that's why even today we face suffering. It's not anybody's fault. It's not God's fault, right? And that's what a lot of people say. An atheist most of the time has had to struggle through suffering. And out of that suffering, they've declared in their own self there is no God, because a loving God and a good God would never create suffering. God didn't create suffering. Suffering is a consequence that came from sin. And that's what we see here. Look at this suffering. He faced the suffering of being destitute, without necessity, not having things that he needed. That's what's going on around the world today, right? People are in want all over the world. Not because God's not supplied this creation with enough abundance to feed everybody. It's through the sin of the selfishness and greed of man in countries and nations. And so, number one, the suffering of being destitute, it comes from sin, right? And then look what it says next. And of course, we know that because he spent all. He spent his money, his property, his talents, his purpose, his opportunities, his mind, his thoughts, even his own body, his soul. He spent it all in the wrong way. Now, those things are good gifts, just like you and I have been given good gifts from God. But when we use them for our way, not God's way, those good gifts become instruments of sin. So we ask ourselves this morning, who am I living for? Who am I using these good gifts for? But he wasted them. Lord, help us not to waste the opportunities and the gifts that you've given us. The effect of sin is suffering, and it's the suffering of being in need or destitute. Secondly, you probably can tell me now, the second type of suffering that we see is there's famine in the land, natural disaster, earthquakes, tornadoes. Violently, when they take people's lives, people will say, well, where's God at? Well, God didn't create suffering. God created a perfect creation. But sin has the result of suffering, right? If I keep driving my car on empty gas tank, and then when it runs out of gas, I can't turn around and blame my wife. I can't blame God. It was my decision to keep driving it when it was on empty. And so the effect of that is at some point it's going to run out. And so the second point that we see is that natural disasters, when people ask us, why did God allow that to happen? Well, he didn't. Sin caused it to happen. Creation is under the canopy of sin right now, and it's moaning and groaning, and there's going to be tornadoes and earthquakes, and there's going to be natural disasters because of sin. Let me give you a couple other scriptures. Proverbs 11:19. He that pursueth sin and evil will pursue it to his own death. Because thou sayest, I'm rich and increase with goods and have need of nothing. Thou knowest not that thou art wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Revelation 3:17. There's two types of suffering that we see that come from the prodigal's sin, being destitute and natural disasters. Verse 15, and he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed the swine. What a nasty job. But I want you to look at something. The suffering of being enslaved to sin. The suffering of being enslaved to sin. See, a Jewish boy has now sunk deeper in sin because you see the bottom of verse 15, he's feeding the swine. And he's also joined himself to the citizen of that country. He has attached himself to that far country, that life of sin. He's become enslaved to sin. He is the slave of the citizen to feed the old swine. And that's what sin will do. Sin will show you the bright lights of the far country and it'll leave you in the pig pen. So the picture is that spiritually and emotionally he's drained. He's run out of his own spiritual strength. He's now attached himself to the citizenship of the far country, and he's enslaved to the far country. The picture is that sin will lead us and enslave us into the hog pens of the world. He's eating out of the garbage. And so we find that suffering will bring in a sense of enslavement in our life to sin, a servant to sin. And then and that's what the Bible said. Jesus answered and said, verily, verily, John 8:34, verily, verily, I say unto you, whoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And it also shows his humiliation, how low sin brings us, the suffering of humiliation and shame in our spiritual and emotional state of being. And then verse 16, he would have fain have filled his belly. Filled his belly. He's empty. That's what sin will do. Sin will leave you empty. Empty of love, empty of joy, empty of any spiritual peace. He's empty. The suffering of feeling empty on the inside. That comes from sin. And then verse 16, and no man gave unto him. He's sitting there with the pigs, eating the slop, and no man is there with him. Oh, he had all the friends in the world when he had the money and the time. If you got the money, his friends had the time. But when he ran out of money, he had no friends. That's the friendships of the world. It's only in the church that you'll find those friends that'll be honest with you, speak truth, speak love, and be with you in the thick and the thin. He had no friends. And so what we find then is the types of suffering that we see as a result of his sin. And this is kind of the conclusion. Destitute, being in need all over the world. That's because of sin. Natural disasters in creation. That's because of sin. We've infested this world with sin. The feeling of being enslaved, out of control. That's the effect of sin. The feeling of being humiliated, shame and guilt, broken. That suffering is from sin. The feeling of being empty on the inside. That's suffering because of sin. The feeling of being lonely, loneliness. That's suffering. The effect of sin. Even in natural disasters, we find also that would be physical sickness, accidents, tragedy. And so we come to the conclusion tonight. Sin is the reason that we face suffering, not God. And there is universal sin, like the tornadoes over all the earth, because sin is infested. And then there is the individual sins that come because of our own actions. But everybody on this earth, because of the sin that came through Adam, the sin nature of man, is facing a world that is full of sin. And the effects of sin is suffering. And the far country is a picture of the world, a picture of going my own way, a picture of living in the state of worldliness and sin. And anytime we live in that, we can face nothing, we can expect nothing but suffering. Sin. When people say, well, I thought you believe in a good God. I do believe in a good God. And he created everything in perfection and goodness. It's not the Father's fault that the Son is facing suffering. Get that. It's not the Father's fault that the Son is in suffering. It's the Son's fault. And so it's man's fault that there's suffering on this earth. In fact, Jesus came from heaven to eliminate that suffering, to suffer himself, so that he could overcome suffering for you and I on the cross. Jesus suffered on the cross so you and I can overcome this far country and make our way back to the Father's house. And the last thing, God uses suffering for a good purpose, and that sets us up for devotion tomorrow. This boy is going to wake up. God used this suffering for an alarm clock to bring this boy to the place where he remembered the goodness of his Father. God, help us in those moments not to miss your divine alarms to help steer and guide our way. So God uses suffering for a good purpose. And it reminds me of the refiner, how he takes the piece of metal into the boiling water, into the pot. That metal will melt, or into the pot. And as that metal melts, no water, as the metal melts in the pot, the impurities float to the top. Then the refiner or the silversmith will come and take a net and will drag and take the impurities out. And then when the metal is dried, it has become purified. God will use suffering like that in your life. God didn't create suffering. God's not the reason for suffering, but God is so good that he'll turn that suffering into something good. He'll take something out of your faith that's impure. He'll make you stronger. The question is not, how can God change my situation? No, that's not the question. The question is not, how can God change my situation? The question is, how can God change me in the situation? We love you. We hope you've had a wonderful, wonderful week so far. Stay in tune for devotions tomorrow. Have a great day.